Snow didn't fall like weather that winter. It fell like memory, soft, relentless, and without apology. The wind did not howl. It whispered. Through the pines and slats of old barns, down the cracked boards of porches too long unstepped. It carried not just cold, but remembrance, threading between the roof shingles and bare branches with the gentleness of a hand brushing an old photograph. There was no mercy in it, but there was no cruelty either, just time, carried by snowflakes and frost. Clara Belmont lived where the road stopped pretending to be road, past the last stone fence and the burned-out shell of what had once been the Baker family's barn. Her cabin crouched like a secret on the eastern rim of Coldwater Ridge, where the land folded down into thick pine and hidden creeks. The world didn't come up this far unless it was lost or looking for something it didn't want to find. That morning, the sky was the color of pewter, thick and strange, and the light slanted in like it didn't want to disturb anything. Clara stood in her doorway with a tin coffee cup clutched between both hands. The warmth barely reached her fingers. She wore an old wool coat, buttons mismatched, the lining sewn and re-sewn with quiet care. Her boots were cracked, leather darkened by years of snow and ash and mud. She watched the way the snow gathered in corners, around the chopped logs, over the rusted wagon wheel leaning against the wall, and thought of her husband. Lester had once said, "Snow hides things too well, makes you forget where the graves are." That had been before the fever, before the quiet funeral with no preacher, just her and two neighbors who didn't speak, before the silence grew teeth. Today, there were chores. There were always chores. She set the cup down and went to the small goat shed where her one milker, Daisy, bleated softly. Clara worked without hurry. She milked the goat, brushed her, and checked the feed. The air inside the shed was warmer, dense with the smell of hay and animal warmth. By midday, the wind shifted. It wasn't wild. It was warning. The temperature dropped, sudden and sharp. Clara knew this kind of cold. It meant the world would be bone-locked by nightfall. She pulled on her scarf, took her hat from the peg, and picked up the axe, leaning by the door. Time to gather kindling before the snow turned to ice. The woods beyond the cabin were hushed, blanketed in white that pressed down sound itself. Her boots broke the surface crust, crunching slow and steady as she moved between pines. Here and there, dead branches waited beneath the drifts, and she reached for them methodically, like she always did. But then she saw it. At first it seemed like a shadow, dark against the pale snow, a lopsided thing near the edge of the clearing. Tangled in brush and fallen logs, she stopped, squinted, stepped closer. It was a man. No, a shadow of one. He was curled awkwardly, half covered in snow, as if the land itself had started to claim him. His skin was dark, hair braided with something that looked like beads, now matted with blood. A sash, woven and dyed, was frozen to his side, dark with what might have been a wound. His legs were nearly invisible under the snow. She could see no weapon, just frost clinging to his lashes, and the faintest rise and fall of his chest. Clara gripped the axe tighter. This was no place for sentiment. She could walk away. Nobody would know. Folks in town wouldn't blame her. An Apache man, wounded and near dead, here in the woods. It was a story told in whispers over whiskey and cracked coffee mugs. 100 explanations, none of them kind. She stood a long time, wind tugging at her coat. His breath fluttered, shallow, irregular. Her hands moved before her feet did. She dropped the axe. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a moment she'd already walked 1,000 miles toward. Getting him back to the cabin took everything. His weight wasn't just body. It was unconsciousness and the cold deathache of limbs already stiffening. Clara dragged and hauled, paused to pant, whispered apologies to the pines and to Lester's ghost. Her knees bruised, her breath burned, sweat turned to ice on her back. By the time she got him inside, her hands barely worked. She laid him by the fire and stripped off the soaked clothes with jerky, numb fingers. His skin was mottled, wounded, the sash stuck to dried blood. The wound wasn't fresh, it was days old, but deep. She cleaned it with boiled water and old moss from her herb box, hands trembling only when she'd finished. His blood was darker than hers, richer. It stained the cloth like spilled wine. She wrapped him in blankets and moved the rocking chair close, loading the fire higher than she had in months. The rifle rested beside her, but she didn't reach for it. He didn't wake. Not that night, not the next. But he breathed. Clara stayed in that chair, sleeping upright, boots on, waking every few hours to check his fever, change the bandages, replace the water beside him. Her silence was filled now, not with ghosts, but with breath. His. The cabin shifted. It wasn't just the extra body. It was the way sound felt sharper, like the house was holding its breath too. She moved slower, softer. Every creak mattered. On the fourth morning, his eyes opened. They were the color of dark smoke, clear, steady, unafraid. He didn't flinch, but Clara saw the confusion. He looked not at her face, but at her hands, scratched and red from hauling him through the cold. As if he were trying to decide what kind of person she was, that she had not left him to die. She didn't speak right away. Words felt foreign. Finally, she said, "You're safe." Her voice rasped with disuse. He didn't answer. But his eyes didn't look away. She didn't ask his name. Not then. Names carried weight. This moment couldn't hold it. Instead, she handed him the cup of broth cooling near the hearth. He didn't take it, just watched her. She set it beside him and turned back to the stove. Her hands shook again, but not from cold this time. He drank. That evening, the wind screamed against the shutters, but the fire burned steady. Clara sat reading aloud from a faded almanac, her voice uncertain. She wasn't reading for him. Not really. She just wanted to hear a voice, her voice, filling the room. But when she looked up, his eyes were open. He was listening. The shift was small, but it was there. A presence, shared. Later, when she checked the bandage, he let her. Didn't wince. Didn't speak. But when she brushed snow from the window that night so he could see the moonlight, he followed the movement with his eyes. For the first time in many winters, she wasn't alone. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she no longer feared the morning. The snow kept falling. Outside, it buried tracks, whispers, truths, covered everything but the sound of breath and fire, and the tiny, wordless thread slowly stretching between two people, neither of whom had asked to be found. And he didn't die. That was enough. The storm thickened outside, but it wasn't the snow she feared. It was what he might remember when he opened his eyes. Some fires warm, others worn. Clara had lived long enough to know the difference. She remembered once, years ago, when Lester had brought home a lantern that burned too hot. "It'll throw more light," he'd said, setting it on the table like it was gold. By midnight, it had cracked the chimney glass, nearly catching the curtains. Afterward, she'd taken to trusting candles instead. Quiet things. Measured. Now, as March crept in with a hush rather than a howl, Clara could feel that kind of heat again. Not in the fire, but in the air between her and the man sleeping just feet away. There was no lantern this time, but something was building. Not danger exactly. Not yet. But the kind of presence that made the skin on her neck pay attention. He was healing, slowly. The wound at his side no longer wept blood, but it ached when he shifted. She could see it in the way his jaw stiffened when he sat upright. how he'd press a palm to his ribs before trying to stand. But he did stand now, and that changed things. She didn't ask questions. She offered hot broth and pine needle tea and a stitched-together sense of quiet. He didn't speak, but he watched everything, especially her hands. At first, Clara thought it was suspicion. Then she realized it was recognition, the way someone might watch a woman kneading bread and remember the shape of home. She'd begun to speak aloud again, if only to remind herself her voice still worked. The almanac, some yellowed recipes, even an old newspaper with the corner torn off where an advertisement for horse liniment used to be. She didn't aim the words at him, but he listened. One morning, as she read about planting by moon phases, he reached out and pointed to a word, rootbound. His finger was steady. His eyes, when they met hers, held no fear. That was the first time she saw him choose to stay in the moment. Outside, the wind shifted in long, low groans against the pines. Snow had crusted thick around the porch steps. And inside the cabin, the fire's rhythm began to feel like a heartbeat they shared. She started leaving 2 cups on the table instead of 1. Not because he asked, but because it felt wrong not to. He never called her by name, but she found herself speaking to him in soft, second person. "You'll want to rest that leg," or "You can take more if you're still cold." It wasn't a name, but it was something. One day she caught him brushing snow off the window with the back of his hand. The motion was almost reverent. That evening, she left an extra blanket at the foot of the bed he'd started using in the small room off the kitchen. He never said thank you, but the next morning, the goat's pail was already full when she went to milk. The cabin floor had been swept, the fire laid with fresh kindling. She noticed, but she didn't say anything. It was a language of silence, slow, respectful, and rooted in the ache of what neither of them had spoken yet. Later that week, while mending her winter coat by the hearth, she noticed him watching the way she threaded the needle. Not curious, not confused, just present. She looked up and asked, "You ever do any stitch work?" He didn't answer, but he smiled, barely, and shook his head. Then he pointed to the broken fence rail outside the window. She nodded. They worked on it the next day. He didn't need direction. He moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent a lifetime building or repairing things that had been taken from him. She held the rail steady as he hammered it into place, fingers aching against the cold grain of wood. When it was done, he nodded toward the trees. Gray clouds, another storm coming. She felt it too. That night, as dusk pooled violet in the corners of the room, she found him standing barefoot by the door, hand resting lightly on the frame. Not poised to leave. More like listening, remembering. She fetched a blanket from the hook and draped it over his shoulders. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A few nights later, she found something on her seat by the fire. A small carving, unfinished, shaped from soft pine. A bird. Wings curved upward, half complete, its body smoothed, sanded by a careful hand. Clara picked it up and ran her thumb along the ridges. It wasn't decorative. It was deliberate. She held it to her chest for a moment. Then set it on the mantel, just beside the cracked clock Lester had never fixed. No words, just presence. The cabin wasn't the same anymore. The air inside held breath and memory. It echoed differently, now, like the walls themselves had taken to listening. And yet, outside, the world had not changed. One morning she spotted hoofprints near the edge of her fence, fresh deep, not hers, no broken rail, no sign of a struggle. But someone had come near. Someone had watched. She said nothing to the man. She still didn't have his name, but she didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed, eyes fixed on the low rafters, listening to the rhythm of his breathing beyond the half wall. The fire hissed low. The storm was still days off, but something else was coming. The next morning, hoofprints in the snow led too close to her fence, fresh, deep, and not hers. Not all visitors knock. Some arrive like storms, uninvited and armed. The morning came silver and brittle, the kind of cold that made wood cry out beneath your boots and breath hang in the air like a question. Clara had just ladled bean broth into the iron pot when she felt the shift, not in the wind, but in the silence. Outside, the snow had hardened overnight, crusted thick under a sky that refused to warm. Inside, the cabin walls held their breath. She'd known it would come. Ever since she saw the tracks near the fence, she'd felt the hours ticking down, slow and cruel. And now, as she turned from the stove, the sound arrived. Hooves. Not one horse, but several. Slow. Deliberate. Not the rush of rescue. The pace of certainty. She reached for her shawl, draped it over her shoulders with steady fingers. Her eyes found the carving on the mantel. The bird, still unfinished, wings caught mid-rise. She let her hand rest on it a moment. Then she opened the door. 3 men sat atop frost-dusted horses. The wind moved around them, but they stood still as carved statues. In front rode Sheriff Amos Greeley, beard grayed like old ash, one gloved hand resting near the butt of his revolver. To his left was Virgil Pike, his jaw sharp, his expression sharper, and Clara recognized the edge of cruelty in his eyes. The third was a boy she didn't know, young, maybe 20, but already hiding behind a stiff posture and a too-tight grip on the reins. "Clara," Sheriff Greeley said, dipping his chin with the stiffness of a man trying to sound civil while bracing for trouble. "You're early for coffee," she replied, stepping fully into the doorway. The cold kissed her ankles through the floorboards. "No one's here for coffee," Virgil said, spitting into the snow. Clara said nothing. Greeley nodded toward the cabin. "We need to talk." "You always did prefer indoors for your hard truths," she answered, then stepped aside. They came in, boots crunching across the packed snow and then thudding against her wooden floor. The younger man hesitated at the threshold. Greeley didn't wait for him. Inside, the fire crackled, and Kalen, still not called by any name they knew, stood near the hearth. He didn't move when they entered, didn't reach for anything, just turned, slow and steady, his expression unreadable. Clara watched the men take him in. Greeley spoke first. "That man," he said, voice low, "he's Apache." Clara nodded. "He's healing." "We've had reports," Virgil said, stepping forward. "Couple ranches north of Dry Ridge, raided. 3 horses gone. 2 dead. Folks are talking." "He's been here," she said. "You think he rode out to kill and came back to lie beside a fire with a hole in his side?" The young deputy shifted, uneasy. His eyes darted between the carved bird and the rifle leaning by the door. Greeley looked tired. "You know how folks get. Fear moves faster than facts." "Fear doesn't make laws," Clara replied. "But it keeps peace," Greeley said. "That's what I'm trying to do." "By dragging him out of here?" "By finding a way not to," Greeley said, and this time his voice softened. "You're a widow. He's in your home. You pulled him from death's door. You're all the kin he's got in this county." Virgil barked a laugh. "You're gonna make her marry the savage?" The word cracked the air. Clara saw Kalen's eyes flinch. Not his body, not his face, just the eyes. The way someone flinched when a ghost walked through the room. Greeley turned on Virgil. "That's enough." But the damage was done. Clara looked to Kalen. His gaze was distant now, pulled inward, somewhere behind his silence. She stepped toward the sheriff. "And if I say no?" "Then we've got to act," he said, voice flat. "Take him in. Make it official. That'll end with more than bruises." Behind her, Kalen moved, just barely. She felt the shift without looking. Her hands clenched at her sides. "This isn't justice. It's survival," Greeley answered. There was silence for a moment, sharp as glass. Clara turned. She met Kalen's eyes. He didn't speak, but he nodded once. She turned back. Draw up the papers. The 2 hours that followed passed like slow smoke through a cold chimney. A writer fetched the town clerk. Another brought a preacher from the chapel east of the bluff. No one brought flowers. No one brought music. Clara stood in her worn dress, the hem dark with ash from her morning tending. Kalen wore the same shirt he'd bled through 2 weeks before. No one asked him to change. The air inside the cabin was thick with the sour scent of too many men standing too still. The clerk laid out the paper, his pen trembling. He misspelled Kalen's name, wrote Caleb Thomason. Clara didn't correct it. The preacher murmured something about holy union. No one said amen. No rings, no vows. Just ink and obligation. Greeley clapped Kalen on the shoulder. "Welcome to Cedar Bluff," he said. Then they left. The door shut behind them with a wind that didn't belong to weather. Clara didn't move. Neither did Kalen. Finally, she turned to him. Her voice came quiet, like a ripple in still water. "I didn't want that," she said. "I wanted you to live." He nodded, then sat near the fire, picking up the carving knife he'd set down when they came. He turned it in his hands. Slowly, silently, he began to shape the wood again. Clara crossed the room. She watched him for a moment, watched the way his shoulders curved forward, not from fear, but from weight. The weight of endurance, of being claimed. The sun dipped low outside. Shadows crawled up the cabin walls. She sat across from him. The paper with their names sat curled on the table. She did not look at it. She looked at Kalen. He looked back, and for the first time she saw something not hiding behind his eyes, but rising. Not warmth, not peace, but something harder. When the door closed behind the last man, Clara stared at the paper with their names written wrong and said to Kalen, "I didn't want that." He looked at her and said, "I know. Some papers change the law. Others change the room." The morning after the men left, Clara woke to a stillness she didn't recognize. Not silence. She knew silence too well, but something heavier. A presence that pressed at the chest, made each breath feel borrowed. She sat on the edge of her bed, fingers curled around the edge of the quilt, listening for movement from the next room. There was none. Kalen, or Caleb, as the paper now called him, had not slept in the main room since they forced ink onto that page. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't left. But he hadn't been the same. Clara didn't blame him. The day before had taken something. Not just freedom, but the thin thread of trust they'd been weaving. Slow, careful, honest. Now it sagged beneath a weight neither of them had asked to carry. She dressed in silence and found the fire already lit, water warm in the kettle. He was outside. She saw the faint trail of his footprints in the thawing snow, leading around back toward the edge of the ridge. She let him be. It had snowed lightly overnight, just enough to dust the windowsills and remind the world it wasn't done with winter yet. The air held the scent of melting pine and old smoke, and when Clara stepped out onto the porch, she squinted into the low morning sun and saw him. Kalen sat on the steps, his breath clouding in short bursts, eyes fixed on the sky. He didn't move when she approached. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. His eyes didn't shift. "Yes." Her chest clenched, though she'd expected it. "I wouldn't stop you." "I know." They sat like that, shoulders apart but spirits near. No more was said. That day passed in quiet. Clara mended her coat. Kalen chopped wood. The wind returned by afternoon, but it blew without malice, just a cold reminder of time's passage. That evening, she placed 2 bowls on the table. He joined her. They ate without words, the scrape of spoon against bowl the only sound. When she stood to clear the dishes, she found something beside her cup, a small object wrapped in worn leather cord. She unwrapped it slowly. It was the bird. Finished now. Its wings stretched wide, beak lifted, not flying, but ready. She traced the carving with her finger. The grain of the wood ran like memory through its body. It was warm from his hands. "Did it mean something?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes steady. "Yes." She waited. He shifted in his seat, voice low. "In my people's stories, birds carry messages between worlds." Her hand tightened slightly around the carving. "Is this a message?" He nodded once. "Yes." Her voice dropped. "What does it say?" Kalen's eyes softened, not with apology, but with truth. "That I stayed." She swallowed. "You did." The fire crackled beside them. Outside, wind combed through the trees like fingers in hair. From that evening forward, things shifted, not with speed, but with certainty. They began to speak, slowly, deliberately. He used the words he had, shaping them with the patience of someone who had waited too long to be heard. She matched his pace. There was no rush, no need for noise. One night she asked his name. "Kalen," he said. "It means moonlight." "My mother gave it." "She sounds strong," Clara said. She was. "I'd have liked her." He paused. "She would not like this." He gestured to the paper still pinned by the hearth, the false name scrawled like a brand. "I don't like it either," she said. He looked at her then, truly looked, not through her, not around her, but into her. That night, they sat by the fire a little longer. Neither reached for the other, but something passed between them. A calm, a recognition, a choice, unspoken, but real. In the days that followed, they began to share more than quiet. She showed him how to steep pine needles in the old kettle her grandmother once called the medicine pot. He taught her to draw maps in the dirt, paths between rivers, the names of mountains she'd never heard. One day he pointed toward the far horizon, where snow gave way to haze. "My people walked there," he said, "before the soldiers came." She didn't ask which soldiers. "They burned our homes," he continued. "We buried our names in the snow." She touched the carving in her apron pocket. Her voice barely broke the stillness. "I'm sorry." Kalen looked at her, and his words came soft. "You didn't hold the torch." "No," she whispered, "but I live in the house it lit." He didn't look away. Spring crept in with cautious steps. Snow pulled back from the edges of the ridge. Birds returned, real ones, and Clara began to hum as she worked, a habit she hadn't known she'd missed. Once, while she was washing the clay bowl at the creek, she caught Kalen watching her. Not in hunger, not in sadness. Just watching. Present. He didn't speak, but later he swept the cabin floor without being asked. She began saving seeds. It was a quiet act of rebellion. One afternoon, while Kalen repaired the sagging roofline, Clara found an old tin box in the back of the cupboard. Inside were dried flower seeds. Lilac, maybe. Or bluebell. She brought it to him. "For the garden," she said. He opened it, looked through the tiny husks like they were treasure. "You believe we'll still be here?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I believe I want to be." He closed the lid. "Then we plan." They planted the first rows together in damp earth near the southern slope. No promises were made. None were needed. There were still nights when they said nothing at all, but the quiet no longer scraped. It wrapped around them like a quilt. The cabin had been reshaped by what it held. Grief, yes, but also grace. That evening, Clara received a letter. Folded carefully, forwarded by the store clerk. The envelope smelled faintly of lavender soap. It was from her sister in Montgomery Parish. And it was everything she expected. Questions laced with concern, warnings dressed as kindness, a gentle demand that she come live where she'd be understood. Clara read it aloud in pieces. She says I've lost my way. Kalen stirred the fire. He didn't look up. Have you? He asked. She folded the letter once, then again. No, she said. I think I finally found it. He met her gaze and nodded. Then burn it. She did. Outside, the wind shifted again. The trees swayed, whispering secrets. Inside, the birds still watched from the mantel. And they stayed. That night, as snow fell like dust from heaven, they drank pine tea in silence, and when she reached for his hand, this time, he held it. Some fires you light for warmth, others are lit, so someone can find you. The smoke appeared before the trouble. Clara saw it first as a thin thread curling up from beyond the northern ridge, barely visible against the pale blue of the early afternoon sky. It wasn't the pluming billow of something burning wild. It was thinner, sharper, the kind made by someone who wanted to be seen. She stood in the garden Kalen had helped turn from rocky frost to dark, rich soil. The first shoots were just starting to rise. Green. Fragile things that believed in spring more than she did. Her hands were damp with earth. When she saw the smoke, her fingers stilled in the dirt. Kalen emerged from the tree line a few minutes later, carrying a bundle of branches. He saw where she was looking. He didn't speak. He just dropped the bundle near the woodpile and walked toward her. Slow, deliberate. She didn't ask what he thought. She already knew. That night, they didn't light the lantern. They sat close to the fire, speaking little. The carved bird watched from its perch above the mantel. Clara's mind drifted back to Lester, to a night long ago when riders passed by the ridge trail and never came back. You only see smoke like that when someone wants company, he'd told her, or when someone's lighting a fuse. Kalen stirred the fire with a piece of scrap iron. His hands were steady, but the silence around him wasn't. The next morning, the footprints appeared. Not theirs. Hoofprints. Large, deep. Boots in the brush. Fresh enough that the ground was still crushed flat. Clara checked her traps and found them untouched, but something had been near. Close. Close enough to hear their voices if they'd spoken aloud. Kalen met her halfway back from the tree line. He wasn't armed, but his hand rested near the hunting bow he'd tucked behind the chicken shed. Not raised, just remembered. They stood together, breathing in the still air that now felt too still. Inside, they packed without conversation. She filled a pouch with dried beans, pine tea leaves, and the last of the salt. Folded 2 small books, one with Lester's initials still scratched into the leather. She tucked the carved bird in cloth and placed it carefully in the bottom of her satchel. Kalen didn't take much. A length of leather cord, a bone-handled knife, and the necklace he wore only in the mornings, when she wasn't looking. I want to burn it, he said, just as she was folding her shawl into the bag. Clara looked at him. The cabin. He nodded once. She didn't flinch. Then we burn it. He looked up, sharp. Not because we're afraid. No, she said, because it's time. They waited until dusk. Kalen lit the fire from the inside, starting at the hearth. The logs caught reluctantly, as though the cabin itself wasn't ready to go. Flames licked up the chimney, climbed the timbers, reached for the roof. Clara stood outside, holding the satchel to her chest, her eyes dry. The bird had been removed. Nothing else would be saved. The fire rose steady and clean, not the fire of vengeance or panic, but of release, of surrender, of farewell. Kalen stood beside her, his face lit in orange and gold. Shadows rippled across his cheekbones. His hand found hers, and they stayed that way, watching until the roof buckled and the sparks reached the pines. We'll go south, she said. He nodded. They rode out before the last beam fell, using the old trail past the dry creek bed. The night was silver with moonlight. Trees shimmered like ghosts. They didn't speak, not until the trail dipped into lower scrubland, where the trees thinned and the soil turned red with desert memory. That's when the riders came. 3 of them. They crested the ridge without warning, guns drawn, horses snorting with steam and tension. One held up a hand. "Stop there." Clara felt her body lock. Her heart surge into her throat. Kaelin pulled the horse short. His arms were up before she could speak. She moved to dismount, but he whispered, "Stay." She didn't. The man who stepped forward wore a worn badge on his vest, same shape as Greeley's, but newer, more polished. The sun glinted off it like an accusation. "You're harboring a fugitive," he said. Clara stood straight. "He's not a fugitive. He's Apache. And he's my husband." The men stiffened. That gave them pause, but not enough. "He's under suspicion for an attack on a supply train near Tiller's Fork," the man said. 3 men dead. Witnesses say it was Apache. Clara's voice didn't tremble. "That's not possible. He's been with me since the first snow." One of the riders scoffed. "You'd say that." Kaelin stepped forward. Clara tried to catch his arm, missed. "Let her go," he said. The leader narrowed his eyes. "You don't speak for her." Kaelin stood still, shoulders squared, voice calm. "I speak to protect her. You want blood," he added softer. "I'm giving you a target. Not her." "No," Clara said, stepping beside him. "We stand together." The moment hung, thin as a thread. Then, a gunshot cracked the air. Clara jerked, her knees buckled. For a moment, everything stopped. Kaelin caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her like something sacred. Her side was wet. Not fatal, but bleeding fast. She blinked up at him, dazed. "I'm all right," she whispered. "Stay." The men shouted now, chaos, arguing. Kaelin rose, eyes blazing. "She's not your enemy," he said. "Neither am I." The young rider, the one who hadn't spoken, dismounted. He moved slowly, rifle lowered. "This ain't justice," he said. "She's bleedin'. This ain't right." The leader hesitated. His face twitched. "We're done here," the younger man said. And just like that, they left. No more words, just hoofbeats fading into the brush. Kaelin knelt beside her again, tore a strip from his cloak, pressed it to the wound. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "I did." He didn't look away, and neither did she. Later, Clara would not remember the ride, only the warmth of Kaelin's arms and the sound of his voice saying over and over, "You're still here. You're still here." Some places are too far for maps, but not for memory. The hollow they found was not marked on any trail. It wasn't a place people went. It was a place the wind settled into. Cradled by low hills and fed by a creek that bubbled faintly beneath cedar roots. The air there tasted different, sweeter somehow, though it still held the cold. When Kaelin carried Clara across the final stretch of gravel and mud, her breath shallow but steady, the land opened its arms without question. He set her down in the lean of a moss-covered boulder, the last light fading fast. The bleeding had slowed, but her skin was pale, eyes fluttering. He spoke to her in low tones, not words she knew, but they wrapped around her like cotton batting. She blinked up at him, barely able to speak. "You stayed," she whispered. His brow creased. "Always." They didn't build a cabin. Not yet. They found a shallow cave near the base of a rock face, where someone, maybe another fugitive, maybe no one, had left behind the bones of a long-dead camp, a rusted pot, an old tin fork, the imprint of a fire long cooled. Kaelin cleaned it out in silence. Started a fire from damp wood. He boiled roots, pressed cloth to her wound, and sat beside her through the night, his hand on her arm like an anchor. She didn't speak much for days. Healing takes time, and Clara had learned that bones might knit faster than trust. The mornings were cold, but they grew warmer. Sun crept in from the east a little earlier each day. By the fourth morning, she sat upright by herself. By the seventh, she walked a few careful steps to the creek and dipped her fingers into the icy water. Kaelin watched her, not hovering, just there, a presence without demand. She touched the moss on the rock face beside the water and whispered something. She didn't know if it was a prayer or a promise. By the time a full moon rose over the hollow, she could stand long enough to stir a pot of beans. They shared it sitting in the dust, knees nearly touching, her hair braided back for the first time in weeks. Their conversation remained sparse, but no longer strained. Words came when needed, wrapped in long pauses. He told her about the bird in his carving, the one that always flew alone. She told him about Lester's mother, who used to sing to sunflowers because she believed it made them bloom faster. They spoke like people who had nothing to prove. That spring, they planted a garden in soil that had never known fences. Small things, onion seeds, crushed beans, rootstock pulled from wild stalks. Clara's fingers were stiff at first, but she worked without complaint. She hummed the same low melody Kaelin once carved wood to, not realizing it until he joined her, matching the sound with a whistle that trailed off like wind through tall grass. One evening, she found him repairing an old tin pot. His hands moved slowly, the rhythm of someone who didn't need to finish fast. She watched him from the shade and said, "Do you think they'll come again?" He didn't stop working. "Not here. But maybe someday," she added. He nodded. "Then we'll move again. And if we can't, then we stand." It wasn't said as threat or oath, just truth. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the carving. The bird, still smooth under her fingers, now more familiar than her reflection. She hung it above the stone fire ring, using a nail wedged into the rock. It swung slightly in the wind. That night, 2 travelers passed through. They were older, a man and a woman, with the look of those who'd wandered too long and learned to ask little. They didn't come close, just nodded from a distance. Clara offered them a cup of pine tea. They accepted with grateful silence. As they sat near the low fire, the woman glanced up at the carved bird. Her eyes softened, and she looked between Clara and Kaelin. "You've made a home," she said. Clara didn't answer right away. She glanced at Kaelin. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't look away. "Yes," Clara said. "We did." The couple didn't linger. When they left behind no words, just the way their eyes lingered on the bird, as if it said more than they could. Later that week, Clara and Kaelin finished the new roof on the shelter. It wasn't much, just branches, bark, old hide, but it held off the rain. Kaelin climbed down and helped her secure the last edge with sinew from the deer he'd hunted 2 days earlier. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the sky. "This ain't what I imagined," she said, "but maybe it's what I needed." Kaelin said nothing, but he placed his hand over her heart, then guided hers to his. They stood like that for a long time, not moving. No one spoke of love, but nothing needed to be said. That evening, they sat beside the fire as light dimmed. Clara had written something on a scrap of cloth, words from an old letter she once meant to send her sister. She read it again. It asked for forgiveness she no longer needed. She burned it without a word. Kaelin added dried sage to the fire. It flared and settled, the scent curling around them. Above, the bird swayed in the breeze. And if someone were to come by, a rider, a wanderer, a man looking for fugitives, they wouldn't find names, they wouldn't find law, but they might pause. They might feel something in the hush between wind and flame. They might look up at the carved bird and know that two souls had once refused to be torn apart. And they stayed. And so, when all the smoke has drifted east and the pine trees hush their whispering, when the snow no longer remembers the shape of blood and the last footprint has faded into earth, there remains only a silence filled with meaning and a fire still glowing low, like the last ember of a long-guarded truth. And in that quiet, we feel what lingers, not just the names forgotten by paper, but the lives remembered by wind, the kind that stirs your totem in the dusk and smells faintly of wood smoke and river moss, the kind of wind that knows stories better than people ever could. And if you listen, truly listen, you can still hear the breath of the horse that waited without reins, the creak of a saddle that carried a wounded soul into peace, and you may feel the ghost weight of a carving in your palm, shaped like a bird, with wings not quite in flight, but ready, always ready. And in the fading edge of a day that doesn't quite end but settles soft into twilight, you might think of a woman with ash on her sleeves and pine tea in her hands, who once chose kindness over comfort, who once stood between fear and what was right, not because anyone would thank her for it, but because no one else would. And that choice, quiet, stubborn, and clear as spring melt, is what saved them both. And if you look close, you'll remember how the hollow they made bloomed with wildflowers not planted by hand, but by trust, how the cracked tin pot still boiled roots into medicine, how the carved bird above the fire never fell even when storms came down hard, and you might recall the scratch of handwriting that was never sent, the crumpled page left burning in the coals, the one that asked forgiveness she no longer needed. And you'll know, in your bones, that justice does not always shout. It does not ride in on a white horse or wear a star on its chest. Sometimes, it whispers in a woman's voice as she stitches someone else's name into the lining of her coat and feeds someone else's truth into the hearth until it glows warm enough to survive another night. And you may wonder how many Clara Belmonts walked the West with their heads down and their spirits upright. How many Kalins bore the weight of stories told wrong. And you may wish you could ride back in time and set things right. But maybe the best you can do is remember. Carry the memory like a worn letter folded in your pocket, one that tells you what kind of person you were meant to be, what kind of silence is worth breaking, and what kind of love stays even after the name on the paper fades. And if you believe that a bird can carry more than a message, that a woman alone can choose the truth even when no one listens, then maybe you'll pause before you speak next time someone tells you who belongs and who does not. And maybe you'll light a candle instead of raising your voice. Maybe you'll leave space at your table for someone who's never had a place. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel the kind of peace that only comes when justice is late, but still welcome. And if this story found a place in you, if it stirred something beneath your ribs, or made you think of a fire long gone out, then we ask only that you leave behind a sign, a quiet one, a small flame in the dark to say you still believe in kindness over fear, in standing your ground when the wind gets mean, and in the worth of those who are not asked but still show up. And if you do, if you believe in stories carried on wind and carved in silence, then we hope you'll stay with us a while longer. Maybe subscribe to our channel if your heart says so. Maybe follow us into the next trail, the next porch light, the next voice waiting in the dark. Because as long as there are stories like this one, someone ought to keep listening, someone ought to remember, and maybe, just maybe, that someone is you.